A small-town mechanic fixed an old woman's car for free. She secretly paid off his entire mortgage. The words echoed in Jack Miller's mind as he stared at the letter in his trembling hands. The official bank statement confirming what seemed impossible. His mortgage had been paid in full. 15 years of debt gone. His weathered fingers traced over the numbers, still unable to believe what they were telling him. Outside his small craftsman home, autumn leaves skittered across the driveway, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 3 times. 30 days earlier, Jack had been a different man. The ancient fluorescent lights of Miller's Auto flickered and hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor of the garage. Jack wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag that had long ago forgotten what clean felt like, just like he had. 48 years old, with lines etched deep around his eyes that spoke of worries far beyond his years, Jack moved with the deliberate precision of someone carrying an invisible weight. "That'll be it for today, Eddie," Jack called out to his apprentice, a lanky 20-something with an earnest face and quick hands. "Lock up when you finish with the Henderson truck." Eddie glanced up from beneath the hood. "You heading out early, boss?" Jack's jaw tightened. Bank appointment. The words hung in the air like exhaust fumes, toxic and lingering. 3 months behind on the mortgage now. The 3rd time he'd had to reschedule this meeting. His shoulders curved inward as he pushed through the side door, the familiar scent of motor oil and metal clinging to his clothes. Outside, Millfield stretched before him. 4 blocks of Main Street that constituted downtown, in their corner of rural Pennsylvania. The hardware store where his father had bought his first tool set. The diner where his wife, Sarah, had waited tables before cancer took her 5 years ago. The community that knew him as Jack from Miller's Auto, or Tom Miller's boy, or poor Sarah's husband. The small town had been his anchor and his prison. Jack's boots scuffed against the sidewalk as he made his way toward First County Bank, rehearsing explanations and promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Business had slowed when the factory outside town reduced shifts. Then the medical bills came. Sarah's treatment had depleted their savings, insurance covering only portions of the experimental procedures that had given them 8 more months together. Worth every penny in sacrifice, but leaving him drowning in debt that grew with each passing month. The cold metal of the bank door handle sent a chill through his palm. Inside, the sterile brightness made him blink, his work clothes suddenly feeling inappropriate, like he'd tracked dirt into a pristine home. "Mr. Miller, Ms." Prescott's crisp voice matched her immaculate blazer. "Please have a seat." 45 minutes later, Jack emerged with a 30-day ultimatum. Fined $15,000 for a partial payment, or foreclosure proceedings would begin. The bright autumn day seemed to mock his darkness as he stood momentarily paralyzed on the sidewalk, lungs struggling to remember how breathing worked. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Eddie, boss, there's an old lady here with a broken-down Buick, towed in from Highway 16. Says she's just passing through. Looks like the timing belt, maybe worse." Jack pressed his fingers against his temples. "Give me 20. I'll head back." By the time he returned to the shop, the late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, painting golden rectangles on the floor. In one of these pools of light stood a small figure, a woman perhaps in her mid-70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and clothes that spoke of simple, timeless elegance rather than expense. She turned at the sound of his entrance, and Jack found himself looking into eyes the color of faded denim, clear and direct. Something about her gaze made him straighten his posture slightly. "Mrs.?" Jack extended his hand, suddenly conscious of the grease permanently embedded in his knuckles. "Eleanor Harper." Her handshake was firm, her skin cool and paper-thin over delicate bones. "Though most people just call me Ellie." Jack nodded toward where Eddie had the Buick's hood propped open. "Eddie says you're having trouble with your car." It made the most terrible noise, and then simply refused to move another inch. A small smile lifted the corner of her mouth. "Rather like my late husband when we'd visit my sister." The unexpected humor caught Jack off guard, and he found himself returning a rusty smile. "Let me take a look." Under the hood, Jack's hands moved with a certainty that only came from 30 years of mechanical intuition. His fingers traced belts, checked connections, tested components. The diagnosis was quick and unforgiving. A failed timing belt had caused catastrophic engine damage. In a car this old, the repair would cost more than the vehicle's value. When he straightened and delivered the news, he watched her face carefully. Many people crumbled at such information, especially travelers stranded far from home. Eleanor's expression remained composed, but Jack noticed the slight tightening of her fingers around her purse strap. a gesture he recognized from countless customers receiving bad news they couldn't afford. "How long will I be stuck in Millfield?" she asked. "Parts would take at least a week if we can find them." Jack hesitated, then added, "But honestly, Mrs. Harper, you'd be better off looking for another vehicle. This repair will run about $3,200, and that's if nothing else goes wrong once we get in there." She nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "I see. And I suppose there's not much chance of a rental car in a town this size?" "Nearest place is about 40 miles over in Westbrook." Jack glanced at his watch. "They'll be closed now anyway." Eleanor's composure wavered slightly, a flash of uncertainty crossing her features. "I suppose I'll need a hotel then." Jack found himself studying this woman who stood so straight despite the blow of her circumstances. There was something in her quiet dignity that reminded him of Sarah in those final months, facing the unfaceable with grace. "The Millfield Inn is just up the street," he offered. "Nothing fancy, but clean. I can give you a ride." "That's very kind, but I don't want to impose." "No imposition. I was heading that direction anyway." The lie came easily, born of something he couldn't quite name. As Jack locked up the shop, instructing Eddie to tow the Buick to the back lot, he found himself wondering what Eleanor Harper was doing, driving alone through rural Pennsylvania in an ancient Buick. There was a story there. He could sense it in the careful way she held herself, in the wedding ring she still wore, in the worn leather suitcase she carried with such care. The drive to the Millfield Inn took less than 5 minutes. In the passenger seat of his pickup truck, Eleanor sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze taking in the modest storefronts and homes with genuine interest. "It's a lovely town," she commented. How long have you lived here?" "All my life." Jack navigated the familiar streets without thought. "My father opened the garage in 1962, took it over when he passed. A family business. That's becoming rare these days." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of the bank meeting pressing down again. Family business, family home, all of it balanced on the edge of a cliff. At the inn, Jack carried Eleanor's suitcase inside, waited while she checked in, and found himself reluctant to leave. There was something soothing about her presence, like the quiet that came after a summer storm. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Miller," she said, extending her hand again. "Jack," he corrected. "Just Jack." "Well, just Jack." Her eyes crinkled at the corners. "Perhaps you could recommend somewhere for dinner? I find I'm rather hungry after all this excitement." Jack hesitated, then said, "Maggie's Diner, 2 blocks down. Best meatloaf in 3 counties on Thursdays." He didn't add that Sarah had worked there, that he hadn't eaten inside since her funeral, that he sometimes parked across the street just to see the window where she used to wave when she spotted his truck. "Meatloaf sounds perfect." Jack found himself adding, "I could pick you up tomorrow morning, help you figure out next steps with the car." The gratitude in her eyes made something shift in his chest, a loosening of a tightness he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his natural state. That night, Jack sat at his kitchen table, spread with unpaid bills and final notices. The yellow legal pad before him contained columns of numbers that refused to add up to anything but disaster. He'd sold what he could, worked longer hours than his body wanted to permit, cut every corner possible. Still, the gap between what he had and what he needed yawned wide and uncrossable. The face of Eleanor Harper floated unbidden into his mind. The quiet dignity, the unexpected humor, the kindness in eyes that had clearly seen their share of sorrow. Something about her seemed from another time, when people helped each other simply because it was the right thing to do, not because there was anything to gain. Jack pushed away from the table and walked to the mantel where a row of framed photos stood. Sarah laughing on their wedding day, his parents in front of the newly opened garage, Sarah and him at the lake, a rare vacation during her brief remission. "What would you do, Sarah?" he whispered to the glass and wood and frozen smiles. The house creaked its familiar reply, the settling of old timber that had sheltered generations of Millers. His home, their home, soon to be someone else's. Morning arrived with crisp autumn brilliance, sunlight slanting through half-bare branches and painting the world in gold. Jack arrived at the inn at 8, finding Eleanor already waiting in the small lobby, dressed in a simple blue sweater and pants, her silver hair catching the light. "Good morning, Jack." She greeted him with a warmth that suggested they were old friends rather than strangers thrown together by circumstance. "Morning, Mrs. Harper." "Ellie, please." "Mrs. Harper makes me feel like I should be looking for my reading glasses and complaining about my arthritis." Her eyes twinkled. "Though I do both with alarming frequency these days." At the garage, Jack watched as she surveyed the Buick with a practical eye. "It served me well for 15 years, she said without sentimentality. "But perhaps it's time to let it go." Jack nodded. "I could call a few places, see what they'd give you for parts." "And what about local options for a replacement?" "Nothing fancy, just reliable." Jack thought for a moment. "There's Westbrook Auto Sales, but they'll overcharge you. I know a few people with decent cars for sale, though. Could make some calls." Eleanor considered this, then asked, "What would you recommend as a mechanic?" The question, so directly seeking his expertise rather than his service, caught Jack off guard. When was the last time someone had asked for his opinion rather than his labor? They spent the morning calling contacts, with Jack explaining each option in detail. Not just the price, but the history, the potential issues, the true value. By noon, they had 3 possibilities lined up to see the following day. "You must be hungry," Jack said as they finished the last call. "Can I take you to lunch?" The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. When had he last invited anyone to a meal? "I'd like that," Eleanor said simply. They ended up at Maggie's Diner, Jack hesitating only briefly before pushing open the door he hadn't walked through in 5 years. The bell jingled overhead and several heads turned. Recognition, surprise, and something like compassion flashed across familiar faces. Jack Miller. Maggie herself called from behind the counter, her ample figure and bright red hair unchanged by the years. "Well, I'll be... Table for 2? The corner booth where he and Sarah used to sit was open. Of course it was. Jack steered Eleanor toward a different table by the window. "Friend of yours?" Eleanor asked once they were seated, nodding toward Maggie. "Old friend." Jack picked up a menu he didn't need to read. "My wife used to work here." Eleanor's eyes softened with understanding. "Used to?" "She passed 5 years ago. Cancer." Eleanor reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture so unexpected and gentle that Jack felt something crack inside his chest. "I lost my Robert 8 years ago. Heart attack while gardening." Her voice held the particular tone of those who had moved beyond the raw edges of grief into a quieter, more permanent form of missing. "The person at the bank called me Mrs. Harper yesterday, and I still turned to introduce them to my husband." Jack nodded, words unnecessary between 2 people who understood the particular geography of loss. Lunch stretched into an hour, then 2, as they discovered the ease of conversation between strangers with no shared past to navigate but similar paths walked. Eleanor told him about her life in Ohio, her teaching career, the 2 children now spread across the country with families of their own. "I was on my way to visit my daughter in New York," she explained. "It was to be a surprise for her birthday." "We should call her," Jack suggested. "Let her know what happened." Eleanor shook her head, a mysterious smile playing at her lips. "The surprise can wait a few more days. Sometimes detours are part of the journey." As they left the diner, Maggie caught Jack's eye and gave him a small nod of approval that made him feel strangely seen in a way he hadn't been in years. The afternoon found them walking through Millfield's modest downtown, Eleanor asking questions about buildings and businesses with genuine interest. Jack found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years, about the hardware store owner who'd let him pay for his first tool set in installments, about the time the high school football team won state championships and the entire town shut down for the celebration. "It's a special thing," Eleanor observed, "not to be so rooted in a place." Jack nodded, though the word rooted suddenly struck him differently. Roots could anchor, yes, but they could also bind. He had never questioned staying in Millfield, taking over the garage, building a life within these familiar boundaries. Now, with everything threatening to slip away, he wondered for the first time what it would mean to start over somewhere else. "Your shop," Eleanor said carefully as they passed a young mother struggling with a stroller and grocery bags. Jack automatically stepped forward to help, earning a grateful smile. "It seems to be more than just a business to you." Jack held the door for the young mother, then fell back in step with Eleanor. "It's all I've ever known. My grandfather taught my father. My father taught me. Miller men fix things, that's what Dad always said. And you're good at it. I watched you with that young mechanic yesterday. Eddie, was it? You're teaching him the same way." Jack hadn't thought about it like that. The passing of knowledge is its own kind of legacy. "Eddie's a good kid. Quick learner. The town seems to depend on you," Eleanor observed as a truck driver waved to Jack from across the street. "4 people have stopped to ask when their vehicles will be ready, just in the time we've been walking." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with her perception. "It's just a job." "Is it?" Her blue eyes held his for a moment. "Because it looks remarkably like a calling to me." The word calling followed Jack home that evening after dropping Eleanor back at the inn with plans to look at potential cars the next day. He moved through his empty house, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock that had been his grandparents' wedding gift. A calling, as if fixing engines and transmissions was something holy. He stood in his small home office, looking at the wall where his certificates hung alongside his father's and grandfather's. 3 generations of certified mechanics. The Miller legacy. His gaze drifted to the corner of his desk, where the bank ultimatum lay beneath a stack of bills. 28 days left. The weight of potential failure pressed down on his shoulders, making him hunch forward like an old man. What would his father say, knowing Jack might be the one to lose it all? The thought tasted bitter, like metal and disappointment. That night, Jack dreamed of Sarah. Not the Sarah of the hospital with her paper-thin skin and hollowed eyes, but Sarah from before, laughing as they danced in the kitchen, flour on her cheek from the pie she'd been making. In the dream, she cupped his face in her hands and said something important, something he desperately needed to hear. But when he woke, the words were gone, leaving only the lingering warmth of her touch against his skin. The next few days fell into an unexpected pattern. Mornings at the garage, where Jack found himself explaining procedures to Eleanor as she watched him work. Her questions thoughtful, her presence somehow making the familiar space feel different. Afternoons spent looking at potential cars, with Jack advocating fiercely on her behalf, negotiating prices down with a determination that surprised even himself. "You don't need to fight so hard for me," Eleanor told him after he'd talked a seller down nearly $1,000 on a well-maintained Honda. "I can afford it." Jack felt his cheeks warm. "For force of habit. I've seen too many people get taken advantage of." Eleanor studied him with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to show. "You protect people. It's what you do." He brushed off her observation, uncomfortable with the generosity of her perception. Yet something about her presence in his life, this unexpected detour in his own journey toward loss, began to shift something fundamental within him. On the 4th day, they found the right car, a 5-year-old Toyota with low mileage, meticulously maintained by an older gentleman who'd upgraded to something with more towing capacity for his retirement travels. Jack inspected every inch, tested every system, and finally nodded his approval. "It's a good car. Fair price. Should serve you well for years." The paperwork was completed by late afternoon. Eleanor now had reliable transportation to continue her journey to New York, yet neither of them mentioned her departure. Instead, over dinner at the small Italian restaurant at the edge of town, their conversation flowed into deeper waters. "Tell me about your wife," Eleanor said gently, the candlelight between them softening the edges of the world. Jack's first instinct was deflection, the habitual protection of his most tender memories. But something about Eleanor's presence created a space where speaking of Sarah felt not like reopening a wound, but like honoring something precious. She was... Jack searched for words adequate to contain the essence of the woman he'd loved for 23 years. She laughed with her whole body, had this snort at the end when something really got her going. "Used to embarrass her, but I loved it." Eleanor smiled, encouraging him to continue. "She taught 2nd grade, had a gift for the shy ones, the ones who needed extra time." Jack twirled pasta around his fork without eating it. When she got sick, her students made this quilt, each a square a message or drawing. She kept it on her hospital bed right till the end. "You still have it?" Eleanor asked. Jack nodded. "Folded in the cedar chest at the foot of our bed. Can't bring myself to use it, can't bear to put it away." Eleanor reached across the table, her small hand covering his larger one. "The geography of grief is marked by such treasures and traps, isn't it? The things we can't look at, the things we can't look away from." Jack felt understood in a way that loosened something tight around his heart. "What about your Robert? What would surprise people about him?" Eleanor's eyes brightened at the invitation. "He sang opera in the shower. Terribly. With great enthusiasm and absolutely no talent." Her laugh held both joy and longing. "And he could fix anything, rather like you. But he insisted on reading the instructions first, every single time, even for things he'd fixed a dozen times before. A man after my own heart." Jack chuckled. "My father always said reading the manual was the difference between a mechanic and a guy with a wrench. They traded stories like precious coins, the currency of lives fully lived and deeply loved." For the first time in 5 years, Jack found himself speaking of Sarah without the heaviness that usually accompanied her memory. In Eleanor's gentle listening, He rediscovered parts of his wife he'd buried beneath grief, her terrible puns, her collection of ridiculous coffee mugs, the way she always planted too many zucchini and then left bags of it on neighbors' porches in the dead of night. As Jack drove Eleanor back to the inn, a comfortable silence settled between them. At the entrance, she turned to him with a decisive air. "Jack, would you show me your garage tomorrow? Not as a customer, but as someone who'd like to understand what makes it special to you." The request, so simple and yet so profound, caught him by surprise. When had anyone wanted to understand that part of him? "It's just an auto shop," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. "Nothing is just anything," Eleanor replied with gentle certainty. "Especially not the things we build our lives around." The next morning, Jack arrived early at the garage, seeing it through new eyes in anticipation of Eleanor's visit. The tools organized with methodical precision. The waiting area with its worn but clean chairs, the coffee maker always ready, the children's corner with well-used toys. The wall of photos, customers standing proudly next to their vehicles, some dating back to his father's time. When Eleanor arrived, Jack found himself nervous in a way he couldn't explain. He gave her the tour, not the quick overview he might give a customer, but the real story of the place, pointing out where his father had taught him to rebuild his first engine, showing her the workbench his grandfather had constructed that still stood solid after 60 years. Eleanor moved through the space with reverent attention, asking questions that revealed her genuine interest. She noted the thank you cards pinned to the bulletin board, the collection of license plates from across the country, the system Jack had developed for tracking parts and repairs. "Your father would be proud," she said finally, standing in the center of the main bay, sunlight streaming through the high windows. "You've honored his legacy while making it your own." Something in her words pierced straight through Jack's carefully constructed defenses. The pressure behind his eyes built suddenly, and he turned away, pretending to organize a tool cart. "Jack," Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "What aren't you telling me?" The question hung in the air between them. Jack kept his back turned, his hands gripping the edge of the cart until his knuckles whitened. "I'm losing it," he finally said, the words barely audible. "All of it. The garage. My house. I've got less than a month before the bank forecloses." There it was, the shame and failure he'd been carrying alone, now spoken aloud. Jack's shoulders hunched as if expecting a physical blow. Instead, he felt a light touch on his arm. Eleanor had moved to stand beside him, her expression not pitying but thoughtful. "Tell me," she said simply, and so he did. About Sarah's illness and the mounting medical bills. About the economic downturn that had hit the town hard. About his pride that had kept him from asking for help until it was too late. About the ultimatum from the bank, the impossible sum needed to save what generations of Millers had built. Eleanor listened without interruption, her steady presence an anchor as Jack's words poured out like oil from a cracked engine, messy and unstoppable once the seal was broken. When he finally fell silent, Eleanor nodded once, decisively. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said. "Now I'd like to see your home if you're willing. Not out of curiosity, but because I think I might understand you better if I saw the place you're fighting so hard to keep." Jack's first instinct was refusal. His house was hardly fit for visitors, with its piles of paperwork and the general neglect that came from a man living alone with more worries than energy. But Eleanor's request held no judgment, only a genuine desire to understand. "It's not much," he warned as he led her to his truck. "Few of the most important things in life are," she replied. The drive to Jack's house took them through winding country roads, past fields being harvested, and woods beginning to flame with autumn color. Eleanor commented on the beauty of the landscape, the peacefulness of the setting. Jack's house came into view. A modest two-story craftsman set back from the road, surrounded by maple trees now glowing red and gold. The paint was fading, the porch steps needed repair, but even Jack could see how it might appear to fresh eyes. A home with character, with history, with soul. "It's lovely," Eleanor said, and the simple sincerity in her voice made Jack see his home anew. Inside, he led her through rooms filled with memories. The kitchen where Sarah had taught herself to make French pastries from YouTube videos. The living room where they danced to scratchy records on snowy evenings. The small office where Jack now spent sleepless nights wrestling with numbers that refused to add up to salvation. Eleanor moved through the space with the same attentive respect she'd shown at the garage, noting family photos, asking about particular pieces of furniture, listening as stories spilled from Jack like water from a spring-long thought dry. In the master bedroom, her gaze fell on the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. "The quilt?" she asked softly. Jack nodded, then knelt and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar rose around them as he carefully removed the folded quilt, hesitating only briefly before spreading it across the bed. Bright colors and childish handwriting covered the surface. Drawings of flowers and rainbows, messages of love and hope, small handprints pressed in paint. "Get well, Mrs. Miller." "We love you. You're the best teacher ever." Eleanor's hand gently touched one square that contained only a carefully drawn heart around the words, "Thank you for seeing me." "She saved them," Jack said, his voice rough. "The quiet ones, the troubled ones, the ones everyone else had given up on." Eleanor nodded, understanding perfectly. "And she saved you too, didn't she?" The question caught Jack off guard. "What do you mean?" "The way you speak of her. She wasn't just someone you loved. She was someone who helped you become your best self." Eleanor's eyes held his. "Some people do that for us. They see what we can be before we see it ourselves." Jack felt the truth of her words resonate in his chest. Sarah had believed in him completely, had never doubted his ability to overcome any obstacle. What would she think of him now, on the verge of losing everything? As if reading his thoughts, Eleanor said gently, "She would want you to fight, I think, but she wouldn't want you to carry this alone." They returned downstairs, settling in the kitchen where Jack automatically put on coffee. The familiar ritual calmed him somewhat, gave his hands something to do besides clench into fists of frustration. "How much do you need to stop the foreclosure?" Eleanor asked directly. Jack stiffened. "I'm not looking for charity. I didn't offer any," she replied with calm dignity. "I asked a question." Jack hesitated, then sighed. $15,000 would buy me time. The full mortgage is just under $118,000, but that's not possible. Eleanor finished for him. Yet. The word yet hung between them, a tiny seed of possibility in barren soil. As they drank their coffee, Eleanor asked thoughtful questions about the business, about possible solutions Jack had considered. She listened as he explained his attempts to secure loans, to find investors, to cut costs without sacrificing quality. "You won't compromise on the work," she observed, "even when it costs you." Jack shrugged. "That's not how I was raised. My father used to say, if you can't fix it right, don't fix it at all." "A philosophy that's become rare," Eleanor said, "but one your customers clearly value. I noticed how people speak about you in town, with respect, with trust." By the time Eleanor left that evening, something had shifted in Jack's chest. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the space where hope might grow. The simple act of sharing his burden, of being truly seen in both his strength and vulnerability, had lightened something he'd carried alone for too long. The next morning, Jack arrived at the garage earlier than usual, a plan forming in his mind. If he could just get through this crisis, keep the garage open, there were changes he could make, efficiencies he could implement. He'd been too caught in day-to-day survival to see the bigger picture. Eddie arrived to find Jack already deep in reorganizing the parts storage system. "What's gotten into you, boss?" he asked, watching Jack label shelves with a newfound energy. Jack paused, considering the question. "Just time for some changes around here." The morning passed in a blur of activity. Jack moving between repair work and his reorganization project, making calls to suppliers to negotiate better terms, reaching out to former customers about maintenance checkups. Eleanor arrived shortly after noon, her new Toyota parked outside. Jack felt a strange tightening in his chest at the sight of it. The vehicle that would take her away from Millfield, back to her original journey. "I thought we might have lunch," she said, holding up a bag from Maggie's Diner. "If you can spare the time." They ate in Jack's small office, perched on mismatched chairs, while Eleanor told him about her morning exploring more of the town, meeting locals who all seemed to have a Jack Miller story to share. "You fixed Mrs. Abernathy's refrigerator when the repairman couldn't come for a week," Eleanor recounted. "You helped the Reynolds boy rebuild his first car. You plow the church parking lot every snowstorm without being asked." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "Small town. People help each other." "Not all people," Eleanor said pointedly. "You've built something here, Jack. Something that can't be measured in dollar amounts or property deeds." After lunch, Eleanor asked to see the financial paperwork, the bank notices, the mortgage documents, the garage's books. Jack hesitated, pride warring with the relief of having someone else look at the problem with fresh eyes. "I was an accountant before I taught," Eleanor explained. "After Robert and I married, numbers were always friends of mine." Reluctantly, Jack spread the papers across his desk. The stark reality of his situation laid bare in columns of figures and final notices. Eleanor studied them methodically, asking occasional clarifying questions, her expression giving nothing away. Finally, she sat back, her blue eyes thoughtful. "You're not as far underwater as you think," she said finally. "The garage itself is profitable. It's the mortgage and medical debt that's drowning you." Jack nodded grimly. "Doesn't much matter which part of the ocean you're under when you can't breathe." Eleanor smiled slightly at his metaphor. "True, but it matters when planning how to reach the surface." She tapped the papers thoughtfully. "Have you considered bringing on a business partner? Someone to invest capital in exchange for partial ownership?" Jack stiffened. "This is a Miller business, and it can remain one," Eleanor said gently. "But even your father must have understood that adaptation is necessary for survival." The conversation was interrupted by Eddie poking his head in to ask Jack about a diagnostic problem he'd encountered. Jack excused himself, grateful for the reprieve from Eleanor's gentle but persistent questions that forced him to confront possibilities he'd been avoiding. When he returned, Eleanor was looking at the wall of photos behind his desk. Customers with their vehicles, Jack's father and grandfather in front of earlier iterations of the garage, newspaper clippings of community events. "Your roots go deep here," she observed. Jack nodded, coming to stand beside her. "4 generations in Millfield, 3 in this business, and you feel responsible for continuing that legacy." It wasn't a question. "It's who I am," Jack said simply. "Miller's Auto, Miller's son, it's all wrapped up together." Eleanor turned to face him fully. "But what if the best way to honor that legacy isn't to preserve it exactly as it was, but to ensure it continues, even if in a slightly different form?" The question lingered between them, unanswered but not dismissed. That evening, after Eleanor had returned to the inn, Jack found himself driving aimlessly through the familiar streets of Millfield. He passed the high school where he'd met Sarah at a football game his junior year, the park where they'd walked countless Sunday afternoons, the church where they'd married, where they'd said goodbye. He ended up at the cemetery, standing before Sarah's grave as the setting sun painted the sky in colors too beautiful for such a solemn place. The polished granite bore her name, the dates that contained but could never define her life, and the simple epitaph they'd chosen together during those final weeks. "Love endures all things. What would you tell me to do, Sarah?" he whispered to the stone, to the earth, to whatever might remain of the woman who had known him better than he knew himself. No answer came except the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds settling for the night. Yet as Jack stood there, something settled in him as well. A clarity that had been absent in the chaos of impending loss. Sarah would want him to fight, yes, but not at the cost of destroying himself. Not at the expense of the connections and community they had both valued. She would want him to be brave enough to ask for help, to admit vulnerability, to accept that change didn't mean failure. When Jack returned home, he made a decision. He would talk to Eleanor about her suggestion of a business partner. He would reach out to the community that had supported him and Sarah through her illness. He would humble himself enough to admit he couldn't save his legacy alone. The next morning, Jack arrived at the garage with a newfound determination. He called a meeting with Eddie and his 2 part-time helpers, laying out the situation with a frankness he'd previously avoided. "The garage is in trouble," he told them plainly. "I've got less than a month to come up with enough to stop foreclosure proceedings on both the business and my home." The shock on their faces was followed quickly by concern, by offers of help, by suggestions, some practical, some less so, but all coming from a place of genuine care that humbled Jack more than he could express. "We could hold a fundraiser," Eddie suggested. "The whole town loves you, boss. They'd want to help." Jack's first instinct was refusal, pride rising like a wall between him and the offered support. But Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, and he found himself nodding slowly. "Maybe," he conceded. "Let me think about it." When Eleanor arrived later that morning, Jack was ready to discuss her suggestion of a business partner. They sat in his office, cups of coffee between them, as Jack outlined his thoughts, his concerns, his hope that he might find someone who would respect the garage's history while helping secure its future. Eleanor listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions, helping Jack clarify his own thinking. There was something about her presence that made complicated problems seem more manageable, that created space for possibilities previously unseen. "I may know someone," she said finally, "a former colleague of my husband's who invests in small businesses, particularly those with strong community ties. Would you allow me to reach out to him? Jack hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd appreciate that. The conversation shifted then to Eleanor's plans. Her new car was ready, her unexpected detour in Millfield coming to its natural conclusion. I should continue to New York tomorrow, she said, a note of reluctance in her voice that Jack found himself grateful to hear. My daughter will be wondering where I am. Jack nodded, surprised by the sharp pang of loss her words evoked. This woman who had been a stranger less than a week ago had somehow become important to him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. I'd like to keep in touch. Eleanor continued, her eyes meeting his directly. To hear how things unfold here. And perhaps, she hesitated, perhaps I might visit again on my way back to Ohio. I'd like that, Jack said, the simple words inadequate to express the fullness of his feeling. They spent Eleanor's last day in Millfield together, visiting her favorite discoveries, the small bookstore with the resident cat, the bakery with cherry tarts that reminded her of her childhood, the town square with its ancient oak trees and worn wooden benches. In the late afternoon, they found themselves at the garage again, Jack finishing up a brake job while Eleanor sat nearby, their conversation flowing easily between them. I've been thinking, Eleanor said during a lull, about what you said regarding your father's philosophy. If you can't fix it right, don't fix it at all. Jack nodded, hands moving automatically through the familiar task. It served me well. I wonder if it applies to more than cars, Eleanor mused. To lives, to legacies, to grief itself. Jack's hands stilled as he considered her words. How do you mean? Some brakes can't be fixed alone, she said gently. Some repairs require help, require new parts, require adaptation of the original design. That doesn't make the fix any less right. Jack felt the truth of her words resonate in his chest, in the spaces between his ribs where grief and pride and fear had built their fortresses. Sarah used to say something similar, he admitted. When I'd get stuck on a problem, trying to solve it the same way over and over, she'd say, maybe it's not the solution that's wrong, Jack. Maybe it's the question. Eleanor smiled. She sounds like a wise woman. I think we would have been friends. She would have liked you, Jack said with certainty. You have the same way of seeing through people's walls without making them feel exposed. The evening found them at Jack's house, sharing a simple dinner he'd prepared. His specialty of grilled cheese and tomato soup that had been Sarah's favorite comfort food. The conversation flowed easily between memories and hopes, between the past they'd both loved and lost, and the future that remained unwritten. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor handed Jack a sealed envelope. What's this? He asked, turning it over in his hands. Just something to open after I've gone, she said. A thank you for making what could have been a disaster into something quite different. Jack felt a tightness in his throat. I should be thanking you. You've helped me see things I was too close to notice. Eleanor's smile held a warmth that reached beyond the room, beyond the moment. Sometimes we all need an outside perspective, a detour from our planned route. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the sky a piercing blue that promised a perfect autumn day. Jack arrived at the inn just as Eleanor was checking out, her single suitcase packed and ready beside her new Toyota. They stood awkwardly for a moment, two people who had moved from strangers to something like family in the span of a week. I've made a list of mechanics between here and New York, Jack said, handing her a folded paper. People I trust in case you have any trouble with the car. Eleanor took the list with a smile. Always the protector. Force of habit, he said, echoing his words from days earlier. A good habit, she replied softly. Then, with a decisiveness that seemed characteristic of her, Eleanor stepped forward and embraced him. Jack found himself returning the hug, this small woman somehow enfolding him in a sense of security he hadn't felt in years. This isn't goodbye, Eleanor said as she stepped back. It's just until next time. Jack nodded, throat too tight for words. He watched as she drove away, the Toyota moving smoothly down Main Street until it disappeared around the bend. Only then did he remember the envelope she'd given him the night before. Back in his truck, Jack carefully opened it, expecting perhaps a thank you note, maybe a small gift. Instead, he found official-looking documents from First County Bank and a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery. His hands trembled as he read the bank documents first. Confirmation that mortgage account number 78291 in the name of Jackson T. Miller had been paid in full, all $117,842.36 of it. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Jack stared at the numbers, unable to comprehend what they were telling him. Paid in full, his mortgage. The burden that had threatened to crush him suddenly lifted as if it had never existed. With unsteady fingers, he unfolded Eleanor's letter. Dear Jack, it began in elegant flowing script. By now you've seen the bank documents and are probably experiencing a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, perhaps even anger at what might feel like charity. I hope you'll allow me to explain. 8 years ago, when Robert died, I found myself adrift in a life suddenly emptied of its central figure. My children were grown, my teaching career behind me. The days stretched before me like an empty road with no destination. Then one morning I received a letter from a former student, a troubled boy I'd taught nearly 40 years earlier. He wrote to tell me that my belief in him had changed the course of his life, that the books I'd pressed into his hands, the time I'd spent listening when no one else would, had shown him a different path than the one he'd been traveling. He enclosed a check for $500,000, a fortune to me, explaining that he'd become successful beyond his wildest dreams and wanted to share that success with the person who had made it possible. At first, I didn't know what to do with such a gift. My needs are simple, my life modest by choice. Then I realized this wasn't money to be hoarded, but possibility to be shared. Over the past 8 years, I've been on a different kind of journey, seeking out people whose lives I might touch, whose burdens I might ease, whose potential I might help unlock. Not through charity, which diminishes, but through investment in what makes them extraordinary. You, Jack Miller, are extraordinary. Not just in your skill with engines and tools, but in your unwavering commitment to doing things right, to serving others, to honoring the legacy entrusted to you. Your community needs you. Your father's business needs you. Eddie needs you as a mentor, just as you needed your father. This is not charity. It is recognition of value. The value of a man who fixes more than cars, who holds a community together in ways he doesn't even realize, who carries on a tradition of integrity in a world increasingly careless with such virtues. Consider it an investment in the continuation of something rare and worthy. The only return I ask is that you remain exactly who you are. The man who wouldn't charge an old woman for fixing her car, even when he was drowning in his own troubles. With deep respect and affection, Eleanor. Jack read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the elegant script, before he could begin to absorb what it meant. His home safe, the garage secure, the legacy he'd feared losing, preserved through an act of generosity beyond imagining. But more than the financial implications, it was Eleanor's words about who he was, about his value beyond the work of his hands, that undid him completely. To be seen so clearly, to be valued so deeply by someone who had known him such a short time, it was a gift beyond price. Jack sat in his truck for a long time, the letter in his hands as the world around him seemed to shift and resettle into new patterns of possibility. The weight that had pressed him toward Earth for so long suddenly lifted, allowing him to imagine a future beyond mere survival. In the days that followed, Jack moved through his life with a strange combination of disbelief and clarity. He paid off Sarah's remaining medical bills. He invested in new equipment for the garage. He created a college fund for Eddie, who had mentioned dreams of engineering school someday. And he began to reach outward in ways he hadn't since Sarah's death, accepting dinner invitations he would have previously declined, offering his help more freely to neighbors, sitting on the porch in the evenings and waving to passers-by, rather than retreating into the silent house. Eleanor called every Sunday evening, their conversations spanning topics from the mundane to the profound. She told him about her visit with her daughter, about her return to Ohio, about the garden she was planning for spring. Jack told her about the changes at the garage, about rediscovering his community, about the quilt that now lay across the back of his living room sofa where he could see it daily. 2 months after Eleanor's departure, Jack received a package from her. A leather-bound journal with a note suggesting he might consider writing down some of the stories he'd shared with her, preserving them for future generations. Not all inheritances are financial, she wrote. Some of the most valuable are the stories we pass down, the values we embody, the examples we set through how we live our lives. Jack found himself filling the pages with memories of his father teaching him to rebuild his first carburetor, of Sarah laughing in the kitchen, of Eleanor standing in his garage asking questions no one else had thought to ask. The act of writing became a form of healing, of reclaiming parts of himself long buried under grief and worry. When spring arrived, bringing with it the renewal that had seemed impossible during the barren winter, Jack planted Sarah's favorite flowers along the front walkway. Then, after a moment's consideration, he added a row of blue forget-me-nots, Eleanor's favorite, she had mentioned once in passing. The day Eleanor returned to Millfield, almost exactly 6 months after her car had broken down on Highway 16, Jack stood waiting at the garage, watching her Toyota pull into the lot with a sense of homecoming that caught him by surprise. She emerged from the car, silver hair gleaming in the spring sunshine, blue eyes finding his immediately. Jack moved forward to greet her, his steps lighter than they had been in years. "Welcome back," he said simply. Eleanor smiled, the expression lighting her entire face. "It's good to be back." As they walked into the garage together, Jack realized that Eleanor had been right that day months ago. Sometimes detours are part of the journey. Sometimes the unexpected breakdown leads exactly where you need to go. Sometimes a stranger becomes the catalyst for rediscovering your own worth, your own place in the world. And sometimes in the act of fixing something broken for someone else, you find the parts to repair what's broken in yourself. A small-town mechanic had fixed an old woman's car for free. She had secretly paid off his entire mortgage. But the true exchange between them couldn't be measured in dollars or deeds, only in the renewed hearts that beat stronger for having recognized in each other something worth saving.